Basically, this webinar is one that I did knowing that it would be near the end of my 15 years of working at Discipleship Ministry and Stewardship. But it also builds on my whole ministry, which my ordination was 45, will be 45 years ago on June 10th. And so what I've learned in this role, but also what I've learned from from all those years of ministry, and also from what I've learned from listening to other people about what is going on in their churches, what is working and what's not working. And so those are all, I think, one of the key parts of this kind of position. It's not just being able to talk about things, but being able to listen to what's happening in local churches. When I do webinars, pretty consistently, I try to make this disclaimer because the reality is that I can put ideas on the table, but you are the ones who know what your situation in your local church is. You are the context experts in your church. And so I'm going to talk today about what I see as being 8 kind of key movements that have happened over these past couple of decades that I've been observing this work. And but you are going to be ones to kind of say, well, yeah, that kind of sounds like my church, or oh, our church has been there for a long time. We've kind of made that movement already. Or this is something my church will never be able to change. They're just kind of, they're going to be in a tough spot, and I'm not ready to kind of die on that hill. So all of that is fine. I will continue to put ideas out. You be the expert that decides what's going to work and what's going to get traction in your situation. Why did I call this Stewardship in a New Day? Well, I really think that as I look at these years, how people relate to institutions in general and to the church in particular has kind of changed over the years. There's been significant changes. One of the changes that when I first came into my role here almost 15 years ago, it was the beginning of that movement to electronic giving that became so important. And so how people manage money has changed. People no longer are carrying a lot of cash, and none of us are writing a lot of checks anymore because so much of our transactions are happening digitally. What moves people to give has changed. I tell people all the time, my parents were part of that greatest generation that Tom Brokaw talked about. And I remember my dad saying, well, we just give money to the church because they know what's best to do with it. Well, that's not really the prevalent sentiment as we find in churches anymore. What moves people to give now more is making a difference, making an impact. And what binds people to the church has changed. People don't necessarily become part of a United Methodist Church because their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their parents were part of the church. People are looking for churches that are fitting into what their needs are. Now, God hasn't changed and the gospel hasn't changed, but much has changed as the institution of the church as we move forward. So the first movement that I talk about with folks, and I've talked about this one for a while in different kind of wording, but is we have moved from a place where it was okay to just do a stewardship campaign in the fall and then put stewardship away for another 11 months. I can remember that when I started out in ministry, and this is in the early 80s, the expectation was that I was only going to talk about giving once a year when we did the campaign, and then everybody was going to get a break from that. Well, we found that that really doesn't work. What that does is connects stewardship to the budget, but it doesn't connect it to what's important, which is what is the part of generosity play in developing mature disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So thriving churches is what I've found. Find ways to teach stewardship and keep the stewardship theme present year round with an intentional plan. Now, it's not meaning preaching a stewardship sermon every week, but helping people understand that stewardship is more than just meeting the budget. And it's developing a culture of generosity where people really understand that and they feel okay talking about that. And they're excited to hear about what the impact of their giving is going to have. And you'll hear me talk about that more and more. The idea of a single event, I think, is not enough anymore. And what that does is that kind of brings an approach to saying we can just do this once and then we don't have to deal with it anymore. And the reality is that the day we're in really calls for talking about this on a year-round basis. And I'm not saying that campaigns, we should do away with campaigns, because I think a lot of churches find a lot of success in challenging people to grow in their generosity through having an annual campaign. But what I am suggesting is that that's not in itself is complete. We have to continue to talk about how generosity forms discipleship, how it becomes part of a mature discipleship, and how it's much more than just making the budget. Um, I tell people, and I've told them, I think from pretty early on in this work, that stewardship itself is less about the church's need for money and more about a disciple's need to give. So it's really much more about talking about what blessings come from us by incorporating generosity into our maturing discipleship. So I said, what if this movement, would happen if we got on board with this and we said we were going to set a specific plan out? Well, some of the things that might happen if we kind of adopted that and that kind of had that vision was we would begin to see stewardship showing up in worship more, and not just at times when we're asking people to give. We would see it in stories that might be told, in newsletters or from the pulpit or at a dinner. We would see it in how our mission work was highlighted and celebrated by people. We would see it in compassion and advocacy and justice ministries and all those places. And we'd even see it in how the church provided opportunity for us to use our care of the earth as an example of what God calls us to in good stewardship. And I think we would see it in a growth in our giving, but I also think we would see it in conversations about how do we become faithful stewards of what God has given us, not just for the part that we give to the church, but for the part that we keep for ourselves. How do we spend the money that we hold on to in a way that reflects what Christ has called us to, what God expects from us in terms of good stewardship? And so all of these show, that we can plan that through the course of a year, and it's not just about saying to folks, it's time to give, it's time to give. This is a quote from a book by Lovett Weems and Ann Michael, who both worked in the Lewis Center, and wrote a wonderful book called Generosity, Stewardship, and Abundance. And I think they speak to what I'm talking about because for so long we have kept stewardship as something that's important for keeping the church going, for keeping the church running. And when you get your handouts, look at the statement, and I think it's a great one to share with a finance committee or a church council. Because what he says basically here is, what if it's the other way around? What if God's purpose for the church is that we are there to be the voice and to teach people about what it means to live our lives as stewards of all that God has given to us? Now, I say to folks, this is not necessarily a change that is going to be in the discipline or anything like that, but I think it's an intriguing thought to say that, maybe in the past we've approached it as a driving engine for keeping the church on, open, and the lights on. But what if, in fact, it's God's call to us? Because as you look around the world and you see all the problems that we face, so much of it has to do with how faithful we live with the money and the possessions that we have in all different stratas of income and wealth and all those things. And so that might really be God's purpose for us. And I think it's a great topic to be talked about. The second movement, I think, is this focus on being a church not just for the people who are in our walls, but a church for the community. Remembering that Jesus called us right before the ascension. We're getting ready to celebrate that now. And the last words are go and make disciples. Go. Don't just stay and wait for them. Somebody might wander in, but go and make disciples. Go out into the community. Be the church for that community. We are called to be a church, not just for us, but for them as well. Moving into our community helps us find out the mission that God's called us to do. It makes a vision visible, not just to our members who give and support, but the people in the community who are trying to assess what kind of church we are. It's a focus on participation in the life of the community and not just preservation of a building. And it involves listening to others. It involves getting out of the church and hearing what people's needs are and what's happening in our community area and how the church can meet those needs and speak to those folks. Some of you who are older and may remember this phrase from the American Express card commercials, that membership had its privileges. It's back when the American Express folks were trying to tell us that if we had this card, we were going to be some kind of special people and there were going to be special privileges that go along. And I can remember hearing that as a young pastor and thinking, Well, I really don't know that that membership word has that connotation in the church setting. And I think as we've moved on, we've kind of looked at saying, well, just membership is not, it sounds more like a club than people who are called to mission. And I believe that that's what our churches are. Our churches are mission centers for local communities. And community impact builds our meaning. It connects us to what we're about. And one of the things we know, and I'll talk about more, is that impact stories are what people are looking for. They want to know how their giving is making a difference. It's that being able to offer people to grow generously and tell those stories that are so important. As I travel to these annual conferences, every once in a while I get to be in the conference when they read the appointments of the new pastors. And one of the things I've heard more and more as I've traveled to every annual conference across the U.S. and some of them outside the U.S. Is that oftentimes bishops now are, and when they read the appointments or superintendents, are reminding pastors that they're not just appointed to the church, they're appointed to the community. And that being an important part of our caring for them. And this last line is just a story that I've carried with me since seminary when we were all going out for our first pastor parish relations committee meeting to get our first appointment. One fellow who was a friend of mine at seminary and was a second career call to ministry person, had done a career, and in retiring, he had given himself to go to seminary and go into ministry. And so he was the first one to get one of these appointments to go and meet with a PPR committee. And the next day we came back and we were all excited to hear about how his interview went. And he kind of looked at us and he sort of said, well, he said, I had this dream that I was going to be a fisher of men. He said, but what they really want is a keeper of the aquarium. And I thought, that's really oftentimes a good image for us, that, an aquarium has four walls on it, has four sides. And the concern is, how do we keep what's inside the aquarium comfortable? Well fed, temperature warm, all those things that are kind of important, lid and good things to see. But that's not the call that we have. We are called to go out into the community and reach people. And I think that's an important distinction for us to make. This is a little bit of data that I kind of want to share with you real quickly. Giving USA is an organization that reports on charitable giving across the U.S. And they give out a report every year. And I think this report probably comes from 2024, which means it's probably based on 2023 data. But here's the thing I thought was so interesting. Religion has always been the largest part of this charitable giving pie of all the nonprofits and all the other places people can give. Religion usually has had the biggest slice of the pie. But what I happened to notice when I was reading the report was that the size of that slice in the 20 years prior to it had been cut in half. So 20 years back from 2024, it had been 54%, more than half of the pie. And in 2024, it was about 27%. And I just noticed the numbers and said, well, it's exactly half. The next largest piece of the pie was human services. And human services, being the second largest piece, had doubled in that same time and had grown from 7% of the pie to 14%. Again, exactly double. And I kind of said, well, what exactly do they mean by human services? So I looked up how they were defining that, and here's what it said: feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, caring for the elderly, and nurturing the young. And I was reflected on that and thought, well, heck, that's part of our DNA. You look at the history of the Methodist movement, and this is who we are. This is the kind of things that we do. And it's not in any way to diminish the contribution that's being made by organizations outside the church, but it just reminds us that these are the things that people are looking for. They're looking to be involved in meeting these particular needs. And again, we can look at these needs in our community and say, how are ways that we can help engage in these kind of ministries to help folks? Some of you have probably heard this. This is the new vision statement that was prepared by our Council of Bishops and was approved by the Connectional Table. And you'll be hearing more of it if you go to annual conference. I'm sure a lot of annual conferences are connecting with this as part of their themes for conference. But here's the vision statement. It's not changed our mission statement, by the way. This is just a vision statement. The United Methodist Church forms disciples of Jesus Christ who, empowered by the Holy Spirit, love boldly, serve joyfully, and lead courageously in local communities and worldwide connections. And I call to your attention, this part of it is that we lead courageously in local communities. The bishops have made that clear to us, that this is really a call for us to be in ministry and mission in the communities where we serve. We are Christ's representatives to that community and not just to folks who are within the walls of the church. I think it's so important. So the third movement, and I think this is one that probably is oftentimes we are not as conscious about, but it's the idea I think the church consciously needs to be in the business of building trust, both with our congregations and our communities. Generosity grows where trust is strong, and trust has to be continually nurtured. I think the day when we could assume people trust us as an institution may be behind us. It seems like, every time we turn around, there's another news story that kind of paints churches in a different way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is about United Methodist churches. So we've had our share of that. We've had people who only know us as a church that's been arguing over issues for a number of years, who's had all kinds of debates going on. We've been through things like locally, like churches who've gone through financial misconduct. We have seen organizations like the Boy Scouts, who we have supported and been there to know some opportunities for misconduct have happened. And so we really need to, I think, focus on the fact that we have to set up the procedures that help us build trust in people, and make sure that that's something that we know is never permanent, we don't take for granted, but we continue to provide that. I think transparency in churches is excellent. I can't tell you how many times folks have spoken to me and said, here we know what our financial situation is, but there's some money the trustees are holding, and they really don't tell everybody how much money is there, but it's there in case we get in trouble or we have a rainy day kind of a thing. And I always say to folks, I said, I don't think that kind of hiding really does anything good for us. Or churches will contact me and say, well, we received a bequest from somebody's estate, but we don't want to tell people about it because we're afraid that the people are going to stop giving. Well, again, that's not showing a trusting relationship to people who are around us. And it is true, like I say, that we can't assume that trust is there. We have to earn it. So I really encourage people to be about that. When you look at any nonprofit, one of the things they'll tell you are the three keys for donors is belief in the mission, faith in the leadership, and financial transparency in that order. So again, they have to believe in our mission. If we are good about articulating what the mission of the church is, faith in our leadership, those who lead us, not just the pastoral leadership, but lay leadership, that we are being open to folks, and that we're practicing financial transparency. Secrecy breeds suspicion, and donor confidence is crucial as we move into a new day for stewardship. I think it's so important. So what would it look like if we are in the process of building and reassuring people in trust? Well, I think it's important that we explain to people what their money does, how we keep it, how we're utilizing it to support ministry and mission in those ways. And I say to people, don't just explain it, but tell the stories about it, using plain language. Show people how decisions are made at a church council level or trustee level, and invite people's input into that. All those help continue to sustain trust in people. It's so important that we connect dollars to mission. And I'm going to talk more about that, but I think that's key, is that people know that what they give is not just about paying the electric bill or paying the insurance payment, but both of those things and so many others make the ministry and the mission of this church happen, whether it's locally through the annual conference where our ministry shared dollars go, or through the global church and how we reach out to people in all kinds of places to help. And so you tell people, you show what's bad, you show what's good, you show the situations when they're tough, and you help people make that decision in a positive way that they can do that. Let me also add to this, and it's just kind of a tag on to the trust movement, but I just remind people that people always like to be thanked. And I think it's one of the best investments we can make in our time is to go above and beyond and thanking people for their generosity at whatever level. I'm not talking about just thanking your largest members, but the people who are growing in their generosity, hopefully, who are starting out on that journey, and making sure that they feel thanked and appreciated in what they do. I remind people all the time, that quarterly giving statements are a great opportunity oftentimes to not just tell people the dollars that they gave, but to thank them multiple times, and then to even include some little story about where their giving is making a difference. Children in Sunday school, or a food pantry, or a camp program, or some kind of program like that, or a mission project that the church is working on that gives them some stories of impact. Praise people's faithfulness and generosity, and celebrate oftentimes what people are doing now, but also what they've done in the past. Talk about times when there's been a problem in the church and people have stepped up in their generosity. Remind them that they were able to meet those challenges, because that helps kind of people encourage them to say, yeah, remember, I felt good about that. And we could do that even as we move into the future and meet needs that might be presenting themselves there. And so the fourth movement I want to talk about, and this is one that's a reality, I think, for everybody, is that um, we are living in a very digital world right now. We have opportunities through the digital revolution that I never had when I started out in ministry, and even when I planted the last church that I served as a church planter. I didn't have the opportunity for social media and reaching out to people in these ways. I mean, there's just an amazing opportunity that's out there. And again, I wouldn't be doing justice if I didn't remind you that people are managing their money differently. If you have young adult children like I do, you know that a checkbook is a foreign object to them. I've had my kids try to explain to me when I told them how to write a check, saying, "Well, why would you have to write all the words out like that? Why would you have to put 00 over 100 at the end of that line? What's the point of that? It's just a foreign thing to them." And people don't carry cash as often as we do. So again, the digital tools have given us all kinds of new opportunities for people to give electronically. And what we need to do is to respond to that and to make as many options open to people as we can. It's not about doing away with not accepting checks or accepting cash. It's about how do we offer more opportunities, more ways for people to give. Um, and again, those habits are shaped by their trust in saying, that we have investigated the services that we use. We're using reliable services that provide people with opportunities for us to get accurate reports on what people have given. And participation grows when the barriers for folks shrink. And so if you have folks who are hesitant about giving electronically, find some ways that can be more acceptable to them. Maybe doing short videos of how easy it is to kind of get your information in and to put it in that place. I tell the story, I had the opportunity in 2024 to travel to England. And one of the things that amazed me everywhere we went, in churches and cathedrals, in restaurants and stores, um, everything was set up so we could use our credit cards, but no one would ever take our credit cards. They wouldn't handle our cards. That was a no-no in London. And what they would do is you would tap. Everything was pay by tap. And now what I'm seeing more and more is that trend is coming to churches. Churches are setting up these places right in the pew where people can tap their cards and don't have to get their phones out and put all kinds of information in. So that may be the next thing that's coming for us. But again, accepting the fact that the digital reality is just going to give us more options and more ways for people to make it easier for people to give. And when I talk about that, I also going to talk about um, how the digital reality is going to help people find your church. Um, Social media is really where people go and find out information about what's available to them. My wife and I are going through the process of getting ready to move. We need somebody to come in and paint. What do? We don't go to the yellow pages anymore. We go to our local Facebook communities for our town or for our community and say, has anybody had good experience with a painter? And people are doing the same thing with churches. They'll go to people who are their neighbors and friends and say, and just post it on Facebook or one of the other social media things and say, has anybody had a great experience? Anybody have a church that they would recommend to us? We're new to the community. The reality is that people are going to visit your website probably before they visit your church. And also, social media gives you an opportunity for people to talk about your church, to talk about great experience that they have with a worship service or a dinner or a mission event. And again, encourage people to do it. Um, these digital tools are shaping our behavior. And so, again, it's not about one method fitting everybody, but again, greater access for people to give is hospitality. Um, you're probably aware that more and more now, our phones are giving us a way to do spontaneous spending. Somebody texts us and talks about, now I'm getting a lot for political candidates, but for other projects that go on. And would you be willing to give $10 just to help us? If we can get some folks to give $10 or a matching gift or whatever, we would do that. Well, I said to folks, I said, well, why not a spontaneous giving for your church? Why not when your youth group is off doing a mission project and helping people repair their homes, if you were to put some video or pictures with that on your Facebook page and say, hey, they had to raise this money to make this trip themselves. But if you'd like to just, let them know how proud you are with the work they're doing and make a gift, a $10 gift would be a big help to help us send a group next year. And again, it's about more options, not less, and helping people try these new ways of doing things. This is a report from another great source of data, the Barna folks, and they did this support, and I thought this was worth sharing, is that before people financially support any organization or charity, do they do research first? And 75% of the people they polled in a wild spread said, yes, they do research first. And how do they do that research? Well, 39% say they will go to the organization's website first before they consider making a gift. They want information about what you're doing and how you're making an impact. And interesting, the next one is 20%. They'll view your organization's ratings. I never even was really conscious about that, but people are out there giving your church stars. This is a great church, or writing a little review of your church or experience of that. So again, this is why it's so important to have some kind of a presence there and to let people know, to keep a website that's up to date and doesn't just, in the springtime isn't showing the Advent bulletin on the landing page, and keeping that up to date. You'll also notice as you look out at the end of this that only 4% of people would think about talking to a pastor or a religious leader about this. It's much more comfortable for people to go to your website and to get a feel for you at that point. And maybe even watch, if you're streaming your services, maybe they'll even watch part of your service to get a little feel for what your worship experience is like. So if we look at digital tech as not being something that's forcing us to change, but something we can embrace, what is it going to look like? Well, people are more connected. I mean, we experienced that firsthand through the COVID crisis. It's a great way to keep people connected. It can help us reach more people. Things like Zoom now offers closed captioning for folks, but they also offer translation. So there might be a church out there somewhere that's in a community where, like I say, people may not have worship in the language they're most comfortable speaking, but you can stream a Zoom service and put closed captioning on it in a variety of different languages. It's going to give you an opportunity, again, think also to speak in the language of the rising generations who have lived with all this digital technology and understand it and know this is the way we give. This is the way how we manage our money and how we invest in things. And again, it gives you an opportunity to make a case for people why your church is a good place to invest. So that's the first four movements that I wanted to talk about, and we're kind of on track to do this. Let me kind of take a moment to talk about number 5, which is one is near and dear to my heart. And that's the idea that I believe that generosity is learned by people who experience it. And if they don't experience it, if they're not experiencing it firsthand, their own giving it, they can experience it from the stories we tell. So this particular picture is, some of you will remember the United Methodist Church getting involved in the Nothing But Nets movement for malaria. It started off as Nothing But Nets, a sports writer challenging people to give $10 to buy a bed net. And then as the United Methodist Church, as we got more involved in it, we created our own program called Imagine No Malaria. And as we were starting to get into this area of working to promote fighting of malaria, I was working at United Methodist Communications, and they sent a team, a videographer, a photographer, and a reporter to Angola in Africa to gather information about malaria. They arrived at the annual conference office, and across the street was the clinic, and they went over to the clinic to meet the doctor there and learn some more about malaria. And while they were there, a woman brought this little boy, his name was Dominguez, into the clinic, and Dominguez had contracted malaria. And they asked the mother if they could take some pictures, if that would be okay, and if they could talk to her a little bit, and the doctor about Dominguez's situation. And they put him on the exam table, and somebody found this beautiful garment, and kind of put it under his head so his head wouldn't be on the hard surface. And they took their pictures and they talked and tried to get Dominguez to smile and all that. And then they had to go back to the conference office, and they'd been traveling a long time. They needed to get some rest. The next morning they got up, they came right over to the clinic, and they wanted to find out about Dominguez. And they learned from the doctor there that during the night Dominguez had succumbed to the malaria, and that his mother had taken him back to the village where they came from, his body back. And they came home and told us this story in Nashville, and these three folks were just, they were devastated by it because the disease was so easy to cure, it was so easy to prevent in this country, and children were just like Dominguez were dying. And that became a powerful story for us, a powerful motivation for the work we did at United Methodist Communications in communicating the story. So I told that story a few years later in a gathering, a lady session of an annual conference, and I was talking about the power of stories for folks. And I said, I told Dominguez a story, and I said, I'm not asking you to give now or whatever. There'll be an opportunity later at conference, I think, for you to give money for malaria. But I just want you to see the power of a story. And I went on to talk some more until my next point, and somebody raised their hand and they said, and I thought he had a question. I called on this guy, and he stood up and he said, I said, do you have a question? He said, yeah. He said, I have $20 I want to give for bed nets. Are you going how are we going to give that? And he said, I know other people in this room want to do that after hearing Dominguez's story. And he started to walk down, and people started coming up to the stage and putting money on the edge of the stage. And I think the total at the end was about $1,600 that people gave for bed nets. And everywhere I go and I use that as an example, I tell that story. I say, how many pastors on this webinar have been interrupted in the middle of a sermon or presentation by somebody calling for a spontaneous offering? It doesn't happen very much, but nobody's ever raised their hand and said that's happened to them before. But here's the power of a story to get folks moving. And again, it gives meaning to this money that we give. Who wouldn't hold up $10 or $20 if you knew that you could be bed nets to save children's lives? And that's how it moves on. Now, I'm talking about this idea of the stories, about how do we find places to use more of these stories going. And one of the things that I thought of is, we're in the middle of something of a dilemma about what to do with our offering time in worship. And the offering looks different these days. Electronic giving started out, prior to the pandemic, and people were giving electronically, and so the plates would pass. But oftentimes, if a lot of people in the row were giving electronically, there wouldn't be a whole lot in the plate. And so we kind of wonder, well, what does that look like to new people when they come in and they see the plates passing, but people aren't giving and all that? And we kind of struggle with it. And then COVID came along, and COVID really made the whole idea of passing plates pretty unacceptable, because it was just one more way to pass germs. And so I hear people talking about it all the time and saying, well, we really don't do the offering, or we don't know if we should include it, or we put baskets out, or we put boxes out as people leave if they haven't given electronically or whatever. But I really believe, and other people have said this, that when it's time for the offering, it's been a tradition in the churches, and the offering moment is an opportunity to do something, because people are focused on giving and generosity. And I think, what better place would there be for us to use that time for a story time? And so, I talked to folks about the idea of the offering moment. And what would it look like if we kept the offering, but made it a moment, treated it as a worship experience, but use it as a time to tell the stories of impact that people's giving are making? And it opened it up to people of all ages to come and to make an offering of a story, to tell about a place where the church has impacted on somebody's lives. I believe that offering moment, we could reclaim that time, because again, I think it's time we've been focused on giving and generosity, and it could become some people's favorite part of the worship service. that moment when we take a moment to pause and say, this is what our giving has done. Here's how lives have been changed. Here's how the world's been transformed. And there's so many great stories out there to tell. So that's that part of that movement. I believe it's really something that we have amazing stories we can tell, both locally of how we're making an impact as annual conferences and districts, how we make an impact in our areas that people can relate to, and again on a larger scale as we look at the general church about all the places where our giving is going all around the world and impacting places, wonderful places of ministry. So movement number six is I think we really need to talk about money more and not less. And I think really if we're avoiding talking about money, that teaches something to people. That that implies that it's not a subject that's comfortable for us to talk about or appropriate for us to be talking about in the context of Christian discipleship. Um, People will say to me, that they believe that this is what people outside the church think, that all the church talks about is money. That's kind of become sort of a cliche, I think, across the church. But when I say back to people in that is I said, you know what I hear more than I hear that phrase? The phrase that I hear from people is the only time the church talks about money is when they want me to give it. And I think that diminishes the importance of money and possessions and what it means to be a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ. Jesus talked more about money, you probably heard this, than just about any other topic in the Gospels short of the kingdom of God. Look through and find all the stories, all the parables that have their basis on money and possessions and how that gets in the way of our relationship with God. And what I hear when I hear the only time that talks about money is I hear people saying, Anita saying, I'd like to know what does it mean to be a Christian and what does it mean to manage my money because I struggle with it all the time. And there's so much pressure from so many places for me to spend and to do this and to utilize money in these different ways. And how do I do that and be a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ? And so the topics are wide to be talking about that, and we talked about that before. But I believe talking about money is a clear invitation to people to do acts of care, to do acts of spiritual growth. I think that's one of the things that stimulates our spiritual growth and our growth into becoming a mature disciple is challenging ourselves to give more, to manage our money differently in a way that reflects more of our following Christ. And it also carries over to legacy giving. And Chris could talk to you more in your church about this, about people who are looking for a way to make an impact even be during their life and beyond their life. And those opportunities happen when we're not afraid to have to talk about money and how that can make an impact on the world and changing the life. I believe that we really can't be silent about money and possessions and preach the full gospel. I think if we don't talk about it, we're preaching an edited gospel. Um, but we can talk about it and we can ask people to give in a way that's invitational and it's gracious and not putting people who are at a place in one place in their giving in their life and contrasting them against people who may be in a later place in their life and giving at a different level. To remember that as leaders in the church and clergy, I think especially oftentimes have a problem with this because in many of our smaller churches, pastoral compensation, our health insurance, our pension, our salaries, those things take up such a big portion of the budget that we're embarrassed to talk about people giving more. But the reality is, we don't want to talk about giving to the budget. We really want to talk about people giving to the mission of the church and to the possibility of growing our mission, offering opportunities to do more. So, Lovett Weems and Ann Michael, again, I'll use another example from this wonderful book of theirs. They have these two principles, which I've shared a lot with people as I've traveled. I think they're wonderful phrases. They're sentiments that I think I've shared with folks, but never as clearly and succinct as as they shared in their book. And for principle one is you never talk about people's money apart from their discipleship. That's the context in which we talk about people's money, not in the context of our church's budget. We talk about people's money in the context of their discipleship and how, just as we want folks to pray more and read their Bible more, we want them to challenge themselves to grow in their generosity. And the second principle is we never talk about the church's money apart from its mission. So again, we drift away from that part where we talk about the church's income only in relation to our budget, but we talk about it in context of the mission that we do and what more we could do and grow in mission if we had more resources to use to empower those missions. I think this is more than just pithy sayings. I challenge churches to say, what would it have, what would it look like in your church if your finance committee agreed that in any conversations you have about people's money, you talk about it in relation to their discipleship. And if you did the same thing with the church's money, talked about it in the context of the church's mission, and held each other accountable when you slip from that and say, nope, that's not the way we're talking about money now. Remember, we're going to talk about it in relation to mission. So I think that can make a big difference. So what if we invite others to generosity and we don't apologize about doing it and we don't beat ourselves up about doing it? I was in a panel discussion. They invited me to kind of moderate a panel at one of the events I went to. And we were talking about how do we get more comfortable talking about money with our people in our congregations. And one young woman said to me, I said, well, what made the difference for you? And she looked at me and she said, what made a difference for me is I let Jesus do the talking. I don't talk about it for me, but I talk about what Jesus said. And I put Jesus in front of me, in between the congregation and myself. And I said, that made a big difference for me. I felt much more comfortable putting Jesus out there and say, this is what Jesus says. I think another thing we can do, oftentimes I have clergy, especially, who will say to me, I just got out of seminary and I've got all this debt. I got a family. I'm trying to do my best, but I want to grow in my giving. And I feel like I can't talk about it unless I can, reach a certain level in my giving. And I said, well, the key for that is to grow in it, to set goals for how you're going to grow in that giving, whether it's by percentages, you're going to work on a percentage a year until you get to a tithe or go beyond it. I said, that's one of the ways to do it. But one of the things you can do right now is to do something that's extravagantly generous yourself. It could be a one-time gift. Maybe you just want to go in and what you want to do in that is experience the joy that comes from that generosity. We've all heard stories about somebody paying for the person behind them in the supermarket line and thought, wow, that'd be a really cool thing to be able to do. Well, just put a little money aside, say, we want to do something really extravagantly generous with this. And when you experience that joy, then you can talk about that. You can preach about that with a little more authority and saying, here's what happened. It really made a difference. My dad was one who taught me this phrase. He said, if you're giving until it hurts, he said, you're not giving enough. Keep giving more until it feels good. That's really the key of what it's all about. And I think that's so important. And again, as I said earlier, include people's present giving, talk about their future giving, legacy giving, and those kind of things. All in that context, let Jesus do the talking. And again, know that you're opening doors up to people to do an impact, which is what people are looking for. All right, number 7. I got 2 more to do, and we're going to hopefully have some time for questions here. This is one that I see more and more in the church. I think we're becoming more and more attuned to it as we've been through the things that we've been through with COVID and with our whole journey through the disaffiliation thing. Is that I find that folks are looking at property more as a mission tool. Our buildings tell a story about us. And they are resources that now we have to look at in a different way. I think that it's all about how are we impacting mission in our communities. And buildings can be a part of that. They can also hinder us from that. And I use this phrase, about we talk about right-sizing our congregations. My wife and I have been worshiping with a congregation that meets in a building that they built just before the turn of the new millennium. In 1998, they built this beautiful building that can seat about 450 people, I think it was the capacity. But right now they're worshiping with about 85 people at two worship services each. I mean, probably about 170 people total between the 2 services, one contemporary one. And the facility is really an enormous burden on the congregation. And so we're looking at, they're looking at ways to say, how can we use this resource in other ways? And they're inviting community groups to come in and use a sanctuary, a symphony group in the area, I'm not pronouncing their name right, is utilizing it for rehearsals one night a week because beautiful acoustics, and they have their concerts there. Again, it's a way to engage, bring people into the church in that way. Mission must take preference over preservation. You know, oftentimes it's easy for us to get to that point of saying, well, we just have to keep our building looking nice. We just have to keep that. And we have to do that with the context of saying, so that we can continue to do our mission and do that faithfully and speak that word to ourselves. If somebody had mentioned this phrase to me about and asked it, I think it's a great question is, do your buildings take food from the mouths of your missions? Sometimes in our situations they do, and we need to look at that. Remembering that property is not neutral. It's either working for you or it's working against you. There's no kind of in the middle there. And with the COVID revelation, we learned that we can do church without a building, or we can do it in a very different context, in different ways. We can utilize that. All the assets of the church can either multiply or restrict our ministries. And so sharing a building increases its impact. You finding ways that the community, places in the community where space is needed that we can offer. As again, a way that we can attract people and make people more aware of a presence of our building. Oftentimes we're in really good places for that kind of thing. Oftentimes we're a very vocal, a very visual center to the community. So what would it look like if we use our assets for mission and not just as a way to kind of postpone our death? And so many times I talk with churches that have really, and again, I think more in the past than what I'm seeing now, churches that were just hanging on, they were sort of in a hospice kind of a situation is what I think we called it when when I worked on the annual conference level. But now what I see folks doing is saying, hey, we've got a building that's too big for us, but we know another United Methodist Church that is having the same kind of situation. And I specifically, I think back in March, I read this story on the United Methodist News Service about two churches in North Carolina who were in the same kind of boat. And not because the conference put any pressure on them or the bishop put any pressure on them, but the two congregations got together and said, you know what? I said, we're struggling for people and we're struggling for keeping the building up. What if we brought our congregations together and we created a new church and we sold one of the buildings and used those assets to continue to fund mission that we want to do in this community? And they agreed to it, and they sold one of the buildings off. They decided which building would be best for their use and which building would be best for selling. And they came together in a very positive way, not in a kind of like we're at the end of our rope kind of way, but in a positive way. More folks, greater celebrations, more mission, and then the resources from this church they sold, which they decided as they kind of planned what they were going to do with it. There was a third church in that community. There was a smaller congregation, an ethnic congregation that was in an old building that was in need of repair. And they made a generous gift out of the proceeds from the sale of their building to help that church repair their building and bring it up to speed. Now, to me, that looks like mission church. That looks like the church that Christ is calling us to be. And so, again, I invite people, look for ways to give your property purpose and align your ministry to fill that building. And look at your community for what might be the unmet needs. So I'm getting tight. The last movement I want to talk about, and this I think is a really important one, is that we have to find ways to get ourselves out of the scarcity mindset into a mindset of abundance, because God's not a God of scarcity. And most of us in our lives, we experience abundance. And we work among many people who do experience that. Not all of our people, but some people who are living in abundance. But what happens in the church is if we become so focused on what we don't have, on the scarcity, on the gifts that are not coming in, and we get so wrapped up in those kind of things that we get sort of this spiritual myopia where we can't see to the sides. We can only see this little small circle of our financial situation. And we believe that we can't do anything. So to meet that vision of we don't have enough, we shrink our circle of impact. We want to be in that safe little area where we believe we can survive. I hear people say it to me all the time. We talk, they say, well, we're just a small church. And I say back to people, I said, this Methodist movement is all about small churches. It wasn't, John Wesley never had a dream of building a mega church. He had this idea of small groups, of these groups that were committed to hold each other accountable in these classes and these meetings that they had. Small churches are where we're at our best. It's where our strength is. It's not just financial resources, but it's our human resources and time. And and if we just get so fixated on our lack of the financial resources, that can become an excuse for doing nothing. And I say, you can do this. I hear stories all the time. I love to get stories about small churches who have met some big need that was in their community, and they just said, we're going to give it a try. We don't know how it's going to go, and they had great success with it. So here's what happens when we get caught up in that scarcity mindset: is we get together at a table for a board meeting or a finance meeting, and maybe we bring some young people on, some people who are becoming a part of the church who might get excited about missions or new ideas or those kind of things. They might even have ideas of their own. But after being at that table and hearing that kind of scarcity mindset, even when they come up with a great idea or a new idea for a new place we could be in mission, they're afraid to bring it up because they say there's no way they're going to approve doing something new. And they're all so hung up on how they're going to make the next insurance payment. They're just so glued into that idea that the money's not going to be there. And a great idea like that might die and never be spoken at that table. And it might be an idea that turns the church around, that reaches more people in the community, that raises your worship attendance and your giving and all those things that go along with it. But how many of those ideas have died because people were afraid to speak it in this mentality, this mindset of scarcity? And so what if we ask the question, what does Jesus really want us to do here? And if we really come to a situation that everybody kind of agrees and sees, that becomes the vision, then it widens our scope a little bit. What if we started a finance meeting not talking about what our balances were and how we fell short, but before we talked about any of that stuff, talked about what blessings have you seen in this church since the last time we met? I made this idea, I put this forth recently in a webinar. I said, what if we encourage every local church to include an item in their budget just labeled new ministries and put some money in there? In a bigger church, it might be $1,000. In a smaller church, maybe it's $500 or $200 or whatever. But we decided that it was important to have something there in a budget, have a line in the budget that said new ministries, so that it would open the invitation for somebody to get a new idea, that somebody might see a need in the community and say, how can we help? And maybe you say, hey, we've got this money to put towards that idea. And maybe there's some people who would get excited about that, who would want to put some other money towards it because, and the new idea is exciting, a new opportunity to be in ministry and do outreach in that way. So again, finding people who are excited about it, who find some passion or put some energy behind it, can make all the difference. So here's my closing thoughts. And again, we're going to do some questions. And if you can't stay around for the questions, we understand. But I tried to move this along as I could. I get carried away. Don't believe that you need to fix your church. That's not what this presentation was about. What I hope you will do is take some of these ideas on the handouts and start some conversations. Maybe you pick an idea that I've said or shared or whatever, or some variation of an idea that I've shared that you think might get some traction in your local church setting. And one of the great things you can do with that is you pick one thing that you want to kind of try, see if the church will get on board with it. Have some conversations with other people in your church about it. Find some people you think might be interested in that, give you some feedback of ways to tweak that idea or ways that would be more acceptable. And even better, it's that idea of building some critical mass about an idea. Maybe it's a couple other people on the finance committee that you want to talk to about your idea before you bring it to the table. And if they think it's a great idea, all of a sudden it's not just one person talking, it's 2 or 3 or 4 people who are behind an idea. And sometimes it's the small things, but the possible things that can get some traction in that way. So again, go through these, use them if you like. Email me if you have questions, but you have to get off. But Kelly and Chris, what questions do we have? And I'm gonna close out my slide so we can see people when they come on. There we are. Had to find share.
Thank you, Ken. I don't think we have any questions. You covered so much. You covered it so well that I think you've probably given a lot of lot of food for thought for a lot of folks out there. But while if anybody is interested in adding any questions, we're at the hour, but we can certainly go longer. As Ken said, his email address is out there, and we can certainly connect you, or you can reach out to us, and we can connect directly to
Right.
Ken
It's on your handouts too, so it's all kinds of places. Yeah.
at any point in time. We're here to help y'all, as you know, at any point in time. Ken, you referenced us a couple times, and that was certainly gracious of you. In a couple slides, you had bullet points about legacy giving, and that's something that we certainly love to promote and advocate and provide services for our churches, and to understand the critical importance of having a solid legacy giving program in partnership with Stewardship, and how they work so closely together. So reach out to us anytime, and we're happy to make those connections and have those conversations, as well as conversations around stewardship. And we can certainly make connections and help people go that route.
I
So,
see a question.
yep, Ken, we've got
Yeah.
and the first one, if you can see on screen, Reverend
Yep.
Colleen Victor asks, how do you suggest using that offertory as a time of storytelling? Does the pastor do that? Is it an open mic for anyone to speak? Is there one person that you organize to speak for a specific Sunday?
Yeah. So here's a key to that is that one of the things that I've been doing for a bunch of years is I write offertory prayers for every Sunday. This goes back to 2011. So we deliver them in two ways. We started in the last few years putting on the website with all of our discipleship ministry worship resources. And then I also, because prior to that, we sent them through emails every month. So I do a monthly mailing of those offertory prayers. And in the emailed version, I always start with do an invitation to the offering. And in those, I pick out something that I've seen in a news story, or whatever, usually about the general church and about where that portion of people's ministry shares goes and how it makes an impact. And that's just been a little kind of a challenge to me to come up with a different one each month. And, just kind of giving people an opportunity to let people know, this part that goes to the conference and then goes to the general church is making an impact. So that's a good example of one you could get on. That takes care of one Sunday.
Yeah.
And so, if you get on that offertory list, it's a free list to get on. Email me or whatever. I'll get you the link to go on it, and it'll come the 15th of the month before you need to use them. What I encourage folks to do is to also look at, maybe another Sunday, you can focus on what something good the conference is doing, a good mission work that is happening in your annual conference. But the other days are things to look at, very simple things that are going on in your church. And they can be, something as, talking about kids who have gone through your Sunday school who are doing something well. And, you kind of give a report on, Susan graduated just, 2 days ago from college. And, the Susan was here for, all of her high school experience. She was involved in youth group and all that. And we're just so proud that we had the opportunity to, through your giving and all that stuff, to be part of her formation. It could be people doing it as a testimony. It doesn't have to be the pastor telling the story or, somebody from the finance committee. It could be somebody come up and say, we just want to give you about 3 minutes or, whatever the time is the offering here. We just like to give you a little time to say something about how has this church touched your life? In some way, how has our being here made a difference to you? And I know the churches sometimes have used it for bring people in from the community where, the church has been partners with organizations in the community, provided the space, scouts who use your building, can tell them to talk about somebody who's doing an Eagle Scout thing and saying, this particular troop is here because this church was willing to open their doors and include us, and give us a space to be there. So that's the best way I can think about doing it. Now, some folks, like I say, might want to do it recorded ahead of time, do it digitally or whatever. That's a great way to do it because you could build a library of those, and after, you could reuse, like we're all streaming old TV shows, a lot of us are on our services now. So, you'd go back and say, hey, we had this great testimony that Mrs. So-and-so did, and Mrs. So-and-so is no longer with us. She's gone. She's part of our cloud of witnesses. But we just want you to hear her testimony again because we're so glad that we recorded it in that way. So those are just some of the ideas you can do with that. Um, yeah. So you can just, somebody, I'm probably it's good to have somebody organize it in that way. I think it's a great thing to do. And, if you're still having an opportunity in the church we attend, they have the offering time and about 5 people who get up and go put their offering in a basket somewhere around the church or whatever during that time. And you can invite people to do that. As I'm talking, if feel free to get up and, do put your money in the baskets or whatever. Um,
Ken, we got another comment about the matching donation idea, which I think is great. We've utilized that, I guess, lack of a better term, strategy here at the foundation over
mhm.
time with in our endowment fund match program is a key example. We've done some other things though too to tell a church or a donor or a group ministry, whatever it may be, hey, we're willing to walk alongside you. We think so much of this idea or this ministry or this outreach or this concept to kind of spur new growth that will match it, and hopefully that helps folks motivate and move into move into from the phase of considering to acting.
Yeah, I have a great story about that because I had a church here in Nashville that approached me and they were afraid they were going to get to the end of the year and not have money to pay their apportionments. They kind of were in that kind of situation, and so I met with their finance committee and it was easy because he was right in town here. And well, let me throw this idea out here. I think the amount they needed to raise was to feel good about they would be able to do that was about $50,000, pretty good sized church. And I said, I don't know anything about the church. I don't know who your givers are. I said, do you have anybody in the church who could be a matching donor and could put up, 20 would give $25,000? The finance chair looked at me and he said, I don't know that we have anybody who'd do that. I said, okay. I said, do you know 25 people who would each give $1,000 to be the to do the matching? He said, oh yeah, I could do that. So I don't, I could just go people and say, we want to do this, and could you do that? And they did, and so they did that. They spent a month of August talking about, the good impact, the apportionment, different projects, Africa University, and all these different things that people would get, really good excited about how your offerings are making a difference, kind of a thing, and they used that to focus on that gift, and I think they raised $56,000 because people, just started giving to it. It was matched, and it was because this group had been picked out. And he said, I would go one-on-one with, 25 different people in the church asking them to do that. And I know that wouldn't be a problem for them. They would get behind that. So yeah, it's a great opportunity, especially if you're looking to kind of take care of something like that kind of in a shot. But
It's a great idea.
yeah, so if the one thing I could give you, if you're looking for stories on like the church level, a couple of places, umnews.org is our United Methodist News Service out of communications agency. Easy website to remember. And they've got little news stories that come out that tell you about all this great work that we're doing here and in Africa. There's also a easy website to remember called umcgiving.org, and it'll take you to a page. It used to be its own page, but the link still works, and it takes you to a page that talks about apportionments. It talks about the special Sundays, all those great things, and it has little stories in there that give testimonies about things. And again, that covers the bigger general church kind of picture of where we are on the worldwide network. But again, the local ones, that's sometimes a little harder to find. Your conference communicator probably can help you with some conference ones. And but locally, just kind of look at your congregation, look at places where you're making an impact, and the people who are there, and just try to find those stories. And again, maybe you can't do it one for every Sunday. Maybe it's just but you can kind of put that together.
Ken, I put your email address there for Colleen and others in case they want to connect directly with you and you could link to them to some of the ideas you have today. So
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, it's just K Sloane, Sloane with an E on the end, at umcdiscipleship.org. And if you go to umcdiscipleship.org, the website, you'll see a little button up there that says subscribe, and you can go ahead and click on that and pick down the offertory prayers. I think that's right up there. But email me if you want a link for it. I'll be happy to send it out.